you know, didn't understand the EU at all. But it's not just her fault. It's a problem with foreign policy specialists generally. I mean, I used to go to meetings at the Foreign Commonwealth Office as an NGO leader running my Peace Studies Institute when I lived in London, and they were quite sophisticated. The Foreign Office in those days, in the mid-90s, was inviting in NGOs to discuss. It was within the context of the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, which we're still part of and is still going, called the Helsinki process. And they would bring in NGO leaders like me to discuss, you know, what we can do about security and cooperation in Europe. It's an incredibly important conversation. I suspect those meetings aren't happening anymore because the Foreign Office in the UK has become, you know, a really unintelligent body as far as I can tell. I mean, for God's sake, under Boris Johnson, I mean, how could someone of such lacking in intellectual calibre possibly be given a post like that? You know, to me there must be qualifications, and this is why I think some kind of, one of the lessons of Brexit is that politicians have to somehow be more highly upskilled, you know, to use some jargon. Our foreign policy options are in the dark ages. They're still in the either-or modality. So Britain is either going to be with Europe or it's going to be against it and outside it, you know. Such a barbaric dark ages kind of thinking. Of course, and the choice that was given by the campaigners in the 2016 referendum was, we'll leave the EU and we'll become a great global Britain and we'll have influence all over the planet and everyone will love us. As if that's an alternative to being in the EU. The tragedy of that false argument is that it's premised on a lie. I mean, the whole point of the EU is to augment, support, and stabilise the member countries so that they can then live up to their global responsibilities and fulfil their proper, you know, karma, to use a metaphysical term. I mean, Britain is a global power, and you know, it potentially could be a wonderful force for peace in the world, and truth, and wisdom, and science, and learning, and love. You know, we're a multiple identity nation precisely because the United Kingdom is an international experiment. It should be called the United Kingdoms, plural. And so we need a much more sophisticated understanding of international relations. And I worked, you know, part of my degree I did at the London School of Economics. And when I was given the job of creating a Peace Studies Institute at the University of London, I went and sat at the feet of the teachers of international relations, mainly at the International London School of Economics and Political Science, and met and worked with them, people like Michael Banks and others. And the IR department there does some of the most sophisticated theorising in international relations around the planet. And, you know, I went to their conferences and met a lot of these leading thinkers. I think there's a realisation that things like the European Union are good for increasing the sophistication of a given relationship, network of relationships, and that what we should be doing is working towards maximising the peace quotient of our international relations. I mean, my job, you know, as director of a Peace Studies Institute is constantly to say, okay, so what's the peace outcome if we go down this route? If we stay in the European Union, the peace outcome is actually quite good. The European Union is gradually moving in the right direction, as it always has done, of being a peace project. The great thinkers behind the European Union, Monnet and Schuman and all these great originators, Denis de Rougemont and many others, they were all peace thinkers. And and most of the great statesmen and women, like Simone Weil, who was the first president of the European Parliament, a great Jewish French woman who survived Auschwitz, and she became a lawyer, and she was a liberal in you know, France in the 60s and campaigned fiercely for women's rights and the increased status. We've just had International Women's Day. She's one of the great heroines of the International Women's Movement, who worked for the European Parliament as the president now. And these are visionaries. You know, she was a peace thinker. The European Union should be proud of people like her, and there should be more, and there are. And there's a whole list. I don't have time to go into them all. There's also a new European Peace Institute set up in Brussels just within the last couple of years. They've obviously been reading my emails and notes and projects, because it's almost like word for word taken from what I've been saying for the last 10 years with the European Union Mediation Service proposal, which I proposed literally 10 years ago. Well, this wonderful European Peace Institute, which has superb staff, funding, it's in Brussels, is specifically liaising with the European Union to push it in a peace direction. It's got profound people who worked in diplomacy and non-violent conflict resolution. The executive director is a Cambridge graduate, English chap, who's worked all over the world for the UN and other bodies doing mediation and so on. So, thank God, thank you, we've got a European Peace Institute. And gradually, and my own little European Peace Museum here, and there are others around Europe, gradually we're moving in the direction that the European Union is going to become a serious mediator and mover for peace in not just Europe, but internationally. And I will be working with this European Peace Institute and other bodies to get the European Union to create, finally, as I've been saying for 10 years, a European Union Mediation Service. Now, one of the failures hitherto of this monopolar approach to diplomacy has been our failure to deal with Yugoslavia and our toleration of the chaos and civil wars that emerged, particularly in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the terrible Srebrenica massacre that took place in 1995. Paddy Ashdown later became High Commissioner for the EU and the UN in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but by then it was too late. The massacres had been done. This horrible bitterness existed. It's still not been resolved. Why did we tolerate and allow that to happen in Europe? It's the worst. Kofi Annan said it was the worst human rights abuse since World War II and Auschwitz and so on. 8,000 people were killed by Serb fighters because they were Muslim. They spoke Slavic languages. Bosniak's a Slavic language. They were Slavs, but just because they were Muslim, they were rounded up and shot and buried in trenches. 8,000 people, in Europe in 1995. Now, this is what happens when internationalism is taken over by ethnic or religio-ethnicity. And what happened in Yugoslavia is a warning for us all, and it's a warning for the United Kingdom. When parliamentarians come to vote on Tuesday, they should think about this. Because Yugoslavia was once a wonderful federal country. It had many religions, many ethnicities, peoples living in relative harmony. They had a good standard of living. They had freedom of movement throughout the whole country. They had some of the most beautiful scenery in the world to enjoy. They're an amazing people, the Yugoslavs. And I've been 3 times to their great poetry festival in Skopje, in Macedonia, in the southern part of Yugoslavia, what's now called the Northern Republic of Macedonia, or the Republic of Northern Macedonia. And yet it was allowed to break up and fall apart, and religious and ethnic fighting broke out. That's why I'm against nationalism. That's why I'm against this stupidity of saying my birth people is the ones I'm going to fight and die for against your birth people, and it's your religion or whatever. That's why we need a European Union Mediation Service. Had we had it back in the 90s, this Yugoslav thing the whole thing would have been dealt with differently. My view, if I was in charge of a time machine, like in that great movie Back to the Future, if I was the doctor that could go back in time, I would go back in time, create a European Union Mediation Service in the 80s, and when the Yugoslavs were getting into trouble about how to sort out their problems, I would have immediately said, as European Union Mediation Service, okay guys, look, we're going to mediate you guys, and the only deal here is you've got to stay together as a federal country, but more autonomy is fine, and then you can come into the European Union as one federal country. Not, little bits breaking away like Slovenia or Croatia or whatever. No, stay together as one country, living in peace with a federal structure that could rotate, doesn't have to always be in Belgrade. And you can collectively come into the European Union. We love you, we want you, we like the Yugoslavs. You're wonderful people. You're part of the European dream. That's what I'd do if I had a time machine. And no Srebrenica would have ever happened. Unfortunately, of course, it did. So that's why we need this European Union Mediation Service, and why the European Peace Institute and me and other peace institutes throughout Europe are going to be campaigning on this till it happens officially. And we're going to get some of the budget. This talk about creating the European Union army, I'm sorry, it is a bit silly, and it's not happening. It's just been created as a scare story by Brexiteers that want you to think Europe is some kind of dangerous superpower in the making. It's not. All that it might be is at the most some kind of agreement of French and German and English and Polish generals to have similar sort of manuals or something. It's always a multi-dimensional, multipolar project, Europe. There's no way that the European army can emerge. And anyway, we don't want armies. In the world that I'm working towards, we want a world of enlightenment and planetary peace. We want a top floor built on the Pentagon so that the US Department of Peace is facilitating peacemaking in countries. And we have something similar in Europe. And, so maybe on the NATO headquarters we can build a top floor which is for peacemaking and mediation. It's in Brussels. And then we can also help with mediating the problems of Ukraine and Syria, which is on Europe's doorstep. And the Kurdish situation with Turkey. And the motherlode of all conflicts, Israel and Palestine. A European Union Mediation Service would work objectively and effectively to mediate and resolve all these conflicts. How would it do it? Well, it would fund peace and development work in these countries on condition that the participants cease fire and stop killing each other and build structures of collaboration, which is how the European Union came into being. If we can do it in Europe, we can then export that to Israel, Palestine, to Ukraine, to wherever. It doesn't mean they all become members of the European Union, but they take the torch. That's why I light the candles during these talks. They take the flame of wisdom, of holistic universal gnosis, if you want, that then they can stop killing each other over these, I'm an Israeli, no, I'm a Palestinian, I'm going to kill you till the end of time, No, hang on, we're all everything, we're all and people here. We've been Palestinians, we've been Israelis, we've been Hebrews, we've been and over many, many lifetimes. Let's be philosophers this time round, eh? Let's turn the world into an enlightened place. So that's the project. That's why I'm, the positive stuff. I'm not just against nationalism. I'm not at all. I love nationalism. I've got many nationalities. I love them all. I'm in favour of internationalism or transnationalism because that's where the logic takes us. That's where, if you read Hegel and the great philosophers of the European tradition, you end up with this. This is what Kant called the cosmopolitan outlook. You end up with working for a world federation of nations that solves their conflicts through mediation and non-violent peacemaking instead of wars. War is totally outmoded. Kant said this back in the 1700s. And he was one of the founding visionaries ultimately behind the European Union. I'm 100% with Kant on that, and that's why I've studied him for many years. A great thinker. But Descartes even got there before. Descartes was saying the same back in the 1600s. Let's use reason, folks, he said. Let's work out our differences. He lived at the time of the 30 Years' War, when Catholic and Protestant Europe tried to mutually destroy each other. Descartes was so shocked by it all, he said, hang on, we've got to do some new thinking here, got to reason from primary first principles and find out what we're supposed to be doing as human beings. And that's where he began this rational inquiry, which was the metaphysics behind the Descartesian system. He was from just down the road. There's a village called Descartes, where he came from. I'll be having a conference here at some point on his life and work. And he, although raised culturally a Catholic, he lived in Holland. He had an affair with a beautiful Dutch Protestant woman and had a daughter. You know, he was a cosmopolitan. He travelled throughout Europe. He ended up in Sweden working with Queen Christina, who was one of the most cosmopolitan of Swedish monarchs, who fell in love with the universal ideas of Catholicism and ended up in Rome running an academy. She wasn't interested in being queen. I mean, it's very boring. Wouldn't it be fun if Queen Elizabeth II did the same now? I think if Brexit is tragically, God forbid, goes through, I think she should just renounce the throne and go and live in Rome. And I'll set up an academy of wisdom with her. Elizabeth, I hope you are allowed to listen to my talks. You know, that's a true queen, what Christina did. And she did it partly because of Descartes. You see, the real exciting thing in life is exploring the history of ideas and the currents of thought of which we are made. That's the kingdom of God, if you want, from an intellectual perspective. And so that's what we should be living up to as Europeans, as intellectuals, as British citizens, as UK people, as, you know, it's embarrassing. We've become like the sick man of Europe. And this brings me to my next point about education, because this quote that's come out, you know, May didn't understand the European Union, is abysmally embarrassing to me as a UK teacher, you know, an academic and a teacher in schools. I mean, I've said before, and I'll say again, I met Theresa May when I was a teacher working in an Anglican school in Wiltshire, and she came to give a lecture to the sixth form. I thought she was reasonably intelligent, but I didn't check the small print. I didn't check the details. And obviously, turns out she's not. She's been way out of her depth. Now, I'm not blaming her personally, but I am blaming our British education system that allows people like Theresa May, who's, you know, seems affable and intelligent, to get into such a position of power without ever having studied properly what the European Union is, what international relations is, why peace is so important. And really, I think it's, you know, and the same with people like Nigel Farage and Aaron Banks, these Brexiteer fanatics. Rees-Mogg is similar, but in a different kind of category all of his own. The arrogance of the highly elite aristocracy in Britain is also unintelligent. It has its own little bubble, Eton, Oxbridge, you know, House of Lords, boom. And it never looks outside that, those sort of unquestioned privileges that come with class, wealth, and status. You know, these people should by law be forced to go and spend 2 weeks sleeping rough in the slums of Birmingham, you know, or Glasgow every year. I think every member of the House of Lords, in fact, every member of Parliament should have to do that. I've done both ends of this spectrum, so I know what I'm talking about here. And the problem with our school system, as I experienced as a teacher, is that it is very narrow. Now, in the 1960s, my mother, who worked then at the University of Sussex, began her life as a French teacher and Latin, but she ended up devising a syllabus for European studies in British schools, which was to be implemented as a GCSE or O-level and an A-level. But unfortunately, and I think it's scandalous, the project was squashed. I don't know the politics of how that happened. The School of European Studies at the University of Sussex was sponsoring it. But it was squashed from London, from Westminster, probably a Tory government, which didn't want British school kids actually learning about Europe. And so there is no such thing as European studies on the curriculum in British schools. That's why we have such a narrow and forgive me for saying, but sort of an ignorant curriculum. So, for example, as a religious studies teacher, I always tried to bring in that bigger picture, that European dimension. So you can't really study the history of Christianity unless you study the history of European Christianity. If you look at the origins of the Protestant, the history of the Catholic teachings, the history of how Christianity arose in Europe, you look at the great pioneering saints like Irenaeus of Lyon and the whole Gnostic tradition. And, you know, it's so interesting, the history of European Christianity, but And that's just one religion. Then you want to look at the history of European Judaism and the profound contributions by great thinkers in the history of European Jewish thought, like Rashi in Troyes in France, and all the others. And then you've got the richness of European pagan roots, the classical heritage, Greek, Roman, Celtic, Druid, Norse, Viking, runic, or every kid in Europe should learn about their ancient heritage, their ancient classical cultures. I mean, the Shinto priests in Japan who guard the ancient Japanese wisdom are still revered and respected in the Japanese curriculum. And yet in Europe, the classics is something reserved for a very small elite of people that learn Greek or Latin, like 1 or 2% of the school kids. And then it's normally in private schools like Eton and Harrow and the equivalents. Now I think that's wrong. I think every school kid in Britain should have access to studying our own classical heritage and our pagan ancient roots. And that's why I've been creating a thing called the Pagan Academic and Educational Network in Europe, so that I think it's not just in Britain, but every school kid in Europe should learn about the ancient wisdom of the Greeks and Romans and the Druids, and what was that classical pagan heritage all about. And the same with all the other European traditions that have now come, like Buddhist and Islamic, and the history of Islam is so fascinating in Europe as well. It was a very sophisticated form of Islam. In Spain, the great cultural achievements of Andalusia were foundational to much of what we regard as the modern scientific worldview. They inspired Ibn Rushd and all these great thinkers, Ibn Arabi, inspired the first universities to be created at Paris. It was influences on Abelard, partly from Cordoba and Spain. But Ibn Rushd and people, they were looking at the Quran and they were looking at Aristotle, and they were trying to reconcile the rational approach to the study of reality with the religious revealed approach. And Ibn Rushd and his colleagues were saying it is possible to reconcile these. You have to give reason its due. You have to fully go for truth. If you do that, then you can find the truth in the awe of the sacred scriptures. Think of them as like ore that has some amazing gold or diamonds in, but there's other stuff that you need to ferret away and get at that ore. Well, they were doing that with the Quran, hundreds of years before the first universities were set up in Europe. The Europeans came late to the party, but when we came with gusto, and it was through Abelard and through the founding of the University of Paris that the Bible got the same rigorous analysis for the first time. Abelard and his friends said, let's reconcile this Aristotelian logic with this biblical revelatory tradition. Let's look at the Bible anew. Look, it's got all these contradictory passages, its chronology doesn't work out, it's got people living fabulously long lives, it's got worlds being created in 7 days, it's got all this like inconsistency and stuff. But rather than throwing it all out and saying none of it's true, let's look at rationally what actually can be retained. After all, the text developed over time, over centuries, and so began the study of biblical criticism. That's biblical studies started, which is now a very important subject and has been ever since the days of Abelard in universities. And Spinoza and other scholars in the 17th, 18th century really developed in the universities of Europe the detailed critical analysis of the Bible, and through archaeological discoveries and linguistic and so on. That's a work that's still ongoing. It's very, very exciting. So what I think what I'm saying here is that our education systems can be so much more sophisticated than they are. The school systems of Britain are giving the kids a dumbed down version, just like school food. It's dumbed down slosh, really. Forgive me, it could be better, right? And so too with the intellectual diet that that British kids are being given. For instance, in the study of history, I'm also a trained history teacher, but I didn't really work as a historian teacher because the curriculum they give the kids is so simplistic and so nationalistic. Like the average English school kid in history is going to learn about Julius Caesar, the Roman invasion, the Norman invasion, the Norman castles, spend an inordinate amount of time on the Tudors and the wives of Henry VIII, a bit about the Stuarts, if you're lucky in a good school, and then you move on to a bit about, if you're doing A-level, you move on to like the interminable legislations of the 19th century that put every single school kid to sleep to this day, as Parliament, legislates gradually improved rights for British citizens. Never a mention of Ireland and the Irish famine and what the British are doing there. And then you fast forward on to World War One and spend inordinate time on the battles, and then World War Two. And it stops, pretty much after that. Maybe now's a bit on the Cold War. But do you notice any gaps in that curriculum? There's nothing about European history. It's taught as if there's a thing called British history, which actually they mean English history. Scottish history, Welsh history and Irish history are never taught properly. So the average English kid grows up thinking that England is the United Kingdom. They're never taught properly that there is such a thing as Scotland and Ireland and Northern Ireland and its complex history and the times of troubles. And there's this thing called Wales, which used to be the original inhabitants of Britain before the English came. Oh, and where did the English come from? They came from Denmark and Germany and Frisia. Europe, right? And they were like, okay, Germanic speaking, they had a runic system. That's interesting. So the situatedness of British history in European history is never explained properly. And so that's why we get Brexit. That's why we get people not even bothering to understand how the European Union works. To understand something, you have to love it. And to love Europe, is a difficult but immensely rewarding project. I recommend it to my listeners because it means loving Greece, it means loving Rome, it means loving the Celts, it means loving the Anglo-Saxons, it means loving the French, it means loving the Italians. This complex, multi-dimensional thing that we call Europe repays the love 1,000-fold. And when you love something, you bother to find out about it. So if our British kids were taught to love Europe instead of hating it, they bother to find out how the European Union works. And then when they go on and become prime ministers and politicians, they'd know how to work that system. It's not that difficult, but like anything that's worth loving, it's complex. I've loved a few women in my life. I assure you they are very complex. But if you truly love them, and then you want to find out how that complexity works, they repay you 1,000,000-fold. That's the beauty of love. And who wants simple people to love or simple things? Europe, after all, is named after a Phoenician, and she was a princess and really divine, actually. And many of the greatest European initial philosophers, like Pythagoras, were part Phoenician. So that the Europeans are all descendants of the Phoenicians anyway. This is what I love about European civilization. It's so complicated. So yes, one of the lessons I've learned and take away from Brexit is our failures as teachers. I suppose that's why I'm trying to make up for it with these talks, but our failures to inspire kids with enough passionate love for Europe through our lessons. That's partly because our hands are tied by curriculum setters who are then monitored from Whitehall for political agendas. Now that whole system there needs to be an inquiry into why the British education system is so parochial and so dumbed down. We have to open the floodgates to a proper review of our curriculum. I'd say the same also in science, because science is taught like, here's a series of facts, learn them. No, that's not what science is. Science is starting from a place of wonder. I wonder how this candle is staying alight. I wonder where that flame is coming from. I wonder what that flame is made of. I wonder why when, it burns down, where does that wax go, etc. And that's what the European mind has been doing ever since Thales, ever since the first Greek natural scientists or philosophers. That process of wondering is not taught enough. So we need history of science to be taught, philosophy of science to be taught in schools and in our universities, so that the kids and students learn to wonder properly and effectively, which is all science is. And then, the history of the Enlightenment is not taught. The history of the real achievements of European intellectuals. Philosophy should be taught in all schools, and the history of the deeper thinking into these ultimate questions about both what is matter but also what is spirit. I think this is part of the European heritage that we need to say to the kids is yours now. And if we choose to stay in the European Union, which I sincerely hope, one of the reasons we choose to stay is because we love all this. This is worth studying, my friends. It's worth loving, and it's worth understanding. And only if you love something can you understand it. Okay, now I want to move on a little bit and say, this is a difficult thing, but I have to say it because this week I've been a bit shocked to come across some speeches made by Steve Bannon, who I think I regard him as the intellectual, evil genius behind Brexit. The guy is clever, but he's limited, and I finally found out where he's coming from. I've been musing on this, as some of you who've listened to my talks know. Steve Bannon is the eminence grise behind Brexit. He was helping set up Data Analytica. He's best friends with Nigel Farage. He got Trump into power. And he's been working with Aaron Banks and the whole thing behind the scenes that gave us vote leave and gave us that ridiculous 2016 referendum result. Illegally, actually. It's now been discovered. But the trouble is the law is so slow to catch up. And the people in power in the Tory party, Theresa May and co, have creamed off that accolade of, we're implementing that referendum. So their whole narrative is premised on suppressing the illegality, not allowing that to come out. Until after they somehow they still hope they're going to get away with it, of pulling the UK out of the European Union. I sincerely hope enough parliamentarians of stature and wisdom, some of whom may have heard my talks or may have come across some of my other writings. I've done a journal against Brexit. I've given very, very good reasons, I think, along with other philosophers. I'm not the only one. There are other academics speaking out now. I was invested with an amazing education by the people of Britain. I went to university in the days when you got a grant, you didn't even have to pay it back. I owe the people of Britain the fruits of my learning for the last 30 or 40 years. I'm sharing it back to you, as a work of love. Now, we have Steve Bannon. What does he say? Well, poor old Steve, he was in the military. He's an American Cold War warrior. You need to know that about him first. He's one of those guys that, believed America's all right, and the Russians and anyone sort of left of centre is all evil. They were brainwashed to think that socialists are literally evil. And communists are like beyond evil, they're like Satanists, right? And it's that mentality of the worst kind of Cold War warrior that I find embarrassing. I mean, I did my PhD on the history of the Cold War. I've travelled and worked in America and Russia and the former Soviet Union. My mother was a liberal Marxist. My family heritage is a liberal Marxist tradition of a European variety, so Gramsci and the whole sort of intellectual achievements of French Marxism. I can't buy that anti-socialist, anti-Marxist rhetoric of people like Steve Bannon. They are the kind of people that brought us the Vietnam War, the kind of people that brought us enormously many interventions in Latin American politics. The kind of people